Uh, so just stick my timer on. So just to get clear, Elsline, how long should I speak for? Is
Yeah, about 11:15. Well, speak for half an hour. Question
okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
55 minutes. So if you go more than half an hour, you're eating into your Q&A time.
okay. I will do my best. So here we go. So there's the paper, as I said. Here's the kind of summary. Elsline Kingma and other members of her BUMP research group has, as we all know, stimulated a resurgence of interest in better understanding the metaphysics of pregnancy. And more precisely, they've focused on mereological questions about foster-gravida relations. When are fosters parts of a gravida? My goal in this paper is to raise two problems for the BUMP debate, and they show how they threaten to trivialize the terms of the debate. And then by showing what is required to make sense of the debate, I think I want to show a direction of travel for the metaphysics of pregnancy and beyond. Basically, the individuation of lives is where I think the debate is headed. Okay, so first I'm going to just try and reconstruct the terms of the BUMP debate. This is where I'm headed. Then I'm going to try and analyze the two views, the parthood and containment view of foster-gravida relations. Then I'm going to raise two problems for the central question of the BUMP debate, and then show why lives matter for the future. Okay, so first of all, I need to say a little bit about the metaphysics of pregnancy. So first to the business of metaphysics. In his 1929 book, Biological Principles, J.H. Woodger once observed the tendency of physiologists of his day to think that they were above something called metaphysics, when in fact they were only a little above it. I'm grateful to John Dupre and Adam Ferner and David Wiggins for drawing attention to the significance of Woodger's organicist principles. This is what he says in that book. Dr. Haldane is asking physiologists to give up not their methods of investigation, which are the same as he himself uses, but the intellectual background of what he calls naive materialism. He's asking them, in the words of Professor Whitehead, a process philosopher, to become philosophical and enter into a thorough criticism of their own foundations. But physiologists in general never trouble themselves about such things because they suppose themselves to be above metaphysics when in fact they're only a little above it, being up to the neck in it. They are taking matter as ultimate, but without being very clear about what they've meant by this. And they've been trying to make the facts about organisms fit this notion. Now, I should say the background of materialism is not going to be at issue in this talk, although naive materialism could be a problem. But whatever your view of matter is, and it's a lot more complicated than the old Lego block picture, I can tell you, the difficulty is going to be how to make the facts about pregnant whole organisms fit that notion. Which brings us to the business of pregnancy. Now, pregnancy as a phenomenon is widespread in the natural world, but it's not ubiquitous. Pregnancy names a phenomenon that does not always occur in the sense in which Kingma is interested in. For those of you who know the history, you might know that Lezhnevsky and Husserl talk about pregnant whole organisms, and Peter Simons and Peter van Inwagen take up that notion. So there's a technical sense of pregnant whole organisms, which is relevant to this debate, as we'll see, but the notion that Kingma is interested in is categorically restricted to organisms. But not any old organism is going to be capable of enduring the processes of pregnancy in the way that Kingma and the BUMP group are interested in. So fish, for example, lay eggs which develop in time into other fish. There might be borderline cases of, say, marsupials where pregnancy occurs in an external pouch, but the paradigm cases that the BUMP group are focused on involve placental mammalian pregnancy, where the parts of whatever is in gestation are developing inside the pregnant whole organism. So humans and dolphins will be just two examples of this. Okay, so we've said a little bit about metaphysics, a little bit about pregnancy. In speaking about the metaphysics of pregnancy, you might be thinking of one of two things. You might be thinking of the processes, the various physiological, immunological, and developmental processes involved in a typical period of pregnancy, whatever its temporal duration. Or you might be thinking about the parts of a pregnant whole organism that is enduring the pregnancy. Now, strikingly, and some processualists might think this is the ball game and the very problem. We'll come back to that. The bump group's focus has not actually been on pregnancy itself, the parts of a pregnant process, but it's been on the focus has been on the second notion, the parts of a pregnant whole organism that is at least sometimes capable of enduring the processes of pregnancy. If you were thinking about the various stages and processes of pregnancy, you might think of a cartoon a bit like this. The various physiological processes that are involved. The bump group have been quite critical, I think rightly so, of pictures like this and the Family Guy cartoon, because what is obscured by this kind of representation is precisely the mother, right? The maternal organism or the gestator is obscured. And in fact, what the bump group is interested in is precisely the relation between whatever is in gestation at each moment or period or stage of the pregnancy and the gestating organism. Okay, finally, a note on the terms of the debate. The terms of the bump debate take place in a crossover between Latin and Danish. So the term foster, plural term fosters, is a term from Danish medical case notes that is borrowed from Smith and Brogaard's 2003 essay, 16 Days. And it simply denotes whatever the gravida is pregnant with, regardless of developmental stage. So here's Kingma again. Foster is used as a term for anything that a gravida can be pregnant with, anything from an early embryo or perhaps even a zygote up to a fetus about to be born. Now, this does not imply that there aren't important distinctions between zygotes, early embryos, and term fetuses, but merely in terms of their mereological relation to the pregnant whole organism, that is the gravida, they can be considered alike. Okay, so I take it as read here that in speaking of the parts of a pregnant whole organism, then we're talking about the parts of continuance which may actually constitute the matter of a fetus at one time, being parts of a pregnant whole organism. That's the question. We're talking about parts of continuance, not parts of classes. The question was, when are fosters, or the vaguely boundaried parts of continuance which constitute the matter of a fetus, are parts of a gravida, that is the pregnant whole organism enduring the pregnancy. Sometimes this is explicit, but I hope to show why Kingma sometimes adopts an explicitly three-dimensionalist metaphysics of substance and the parts of a pregnant whole organism conceived as a three-dimensional substance. In her 2019 paper, she just says, look, I'm talking about a common sense understanding of part-whole relations, which are anti-symmetric. And that is open to the interpretation of people like Kit Fine and Peter van Inwagen. So she says, for an example of how the parthood view might work, consider the view by van Inwagen. Now, here's where I'm headed. I'm hoping to show why van Inwagen's organicist principles of parthood and proper parthood, according to which the parts of continuance are parts of something, sometimes that is when they are caught up in a life. These are not merely one way among others to make sense of the debate. They're actually required to make sense of the debate in the first place. So to show that, I'm going to show you the two views of the foster-gravida relation, okay? So to recap, it's simply taken for granted in the debate that there are such things as fosters and there are such things as gravidae. The question is whether the foster-gravida relation should be understood in mereological terms of parthood, proper overlap, or rather mere containment. Now, in her 2018 essay, Lady Parts, Kingma adopted the three-dimensionalist substance metaphysics of Smith and Brogaard to argue for her view that the embryo or fetus is not merely contained by or inside an organism, but is a part of that organism, that fetuses or fosters are literally lady parts. In her 2019 essay in Mind, Kingma made use of van Inwagen's and Fine's common sense conception of the part-whole relation to distinguish two views. She called them the containment view and the parthood view. Now, the first thing to notice is that the question is taken to be a substantive question, and whether or not something is part of an organism is taken to be a metaphysical fact, not determined by psychological or social facts. The second thing to notice is how much the word merely is doing in this debate. So you'll notice that the parthood view actually is built in via negation into the containment view. So Kingma thinks that whether this claim is correct depends on more general questions about what is or can be part of an organism. And there's two directions, she says, you can look for an answer to that question. One is in the direction of biology and the philosophy of biology, and others is to metaphysics. She says in her 2019 paper, she's heading to the philosophy of biology. And in what I'm going to do is look to accounts of organisms in metaphysics. When you look in the direction of biology, you find that the kind of mere containment model, people sometimes say, a bit like a fish is contained within a refrigerator. You see, that simply doesn't, that paradigm simply doesn't fit the kind of placental exchange of the interface of parts. And so here's a random aquarium you can find on Amazon, and it says it's suitable for fish. And the point is simply that if you look to the biology of the case of pregnancy, this sort of analogy just doesn't fit. It won't fit for the pregnant whole organism. Now, this matters because Kingma's presentation suggests that the containment view, and remember it builds in the negation of the part view, is widely assumed in the literature. For example, Smith and Brogard contended that the fetus is inside but not a part of the woman in a way that a tub of yogurt is inside your refrigerator. Now, in Van Imwagen's view, no wholly artificial continuant, such as a fridge or an oven or a dough ball or a yogurt pot, will stand in any properly mereological relation to a natural continuant. However well the occurrence of thermodynamic processes might afford the baking of a lump of dough or the refrigeration of a tub of yogurt is sort of irrelevant. But the point is that not any conception of parthood or mere containment is going to be consistent with the distinction. And this matters because in their 2003 essay, 16 Days, Barry Smith and Berit Brogard explained the relevant notion in mereotopological terms, which they took from Akhil Vazi's work on the niche, by the way. So they say that a refrigerator is one substance, the tub of yogurt is a second substance surrounding the latter. And so if we say the tub of yogurt is inside there, the fridge, we mean that its spatial location is a part of the spatial location of the convex closure of the fridge. That's a mouthful, but we're going to come back to it. Okay. In her 2023 essay, The Mereotopology of Pregnancy, Suki Finn noted the problem here, which is that our understanding of containment must not entail or be entailed by our understanding of parthood. What Finn does is she takes parthood to be proper parthood, and she distinguishes to make the contrast class between what she calls parthood or proper parthood and mere containment. She distinguishes three variants. So containment is where X contains Y if and only if Y is within the external bona fide boundary of X. X part contains Y if Y is contained by X and X is a proper part of, and Y is a proper part of X. And mere containment is where X merely contains Y if Y is contained by X and Y is not a part of X. I hope you can see two problems for the bump debate. I don't think Finn's classification quite gets to the depth of the problem here, and we're going to see why. Because if by some conceivable analysis of parthood or containment, parthood was metaphysically necessary for mere containment, or vice versa, then part containment would make sense, mere containment wouldn't. So here's the two problems. You might begin to see that there's going to be two ways to trivialize the bump debate. The two ways to trivialize the bump debate will be a theory of parthood as identity, according to which proper parthood never occurs, and a theory of parthood as containment, where containment will suffice for parthood. We can think of these problems in terms of Ned Markosian's question about parthood. It's actually a question about proper parthood. In fact, it's a much more complex question than this. But roughly, he thinks, here's a question. He thinks it's simpler and more basic than the special composition question. It isn't, but here it is. Under what circumstances is one object a part of, means proper part of, another one? Here are three ways to ask when proper parthood occurs in a domain, and we can call them, for the sake of a name, the special parthood question, the inverse special parthood question, and the general parthood question. To ask the special parthood question is to seek a principle of parthood of the form for some y, x is a part of y, if and only if something is true of x. To ask the inverse special parthood question is to seek a principle of inverse parthood of the inverse form, according to which some x, x is a part of y if and only if something is true of y. And an analysis of parthood would be true in general, right? So for any x and for any y, x is a part of y if and only if something is true of both the x and the y. So consider a thesis of parthood as identity, PAI, according to which for any x and for any y, x is a part of y if and only if x is y. Now you might think that's crazy, and it's not a conceptual analysis of parthood, but it is a conceivable metaphysical analysis of parthood, according to which nothing is a proper part of anything else. Now, if parthood as identity was accepted, then nothing would be a proper part of anything, and the parthood view would be trivially false. On the other hand, you might think of Markosian's, what he thinks is the most intuitive answer to his question about parthood, is he calls it the spatial theory of parthood. Think of this. So the analysis of parthood is containment in terms of which, for any x and for any y, x is a part of y if and only if the region occupied by x is a subregion of the region occupied by y. This matters because Kingma thinks that the containment view is a received view. It's generally assumed, but remember, it builds in the negation of the parthood view. It also matters for the claim that no prominent animalist has seriously considered these questions. I'm going to show you that Van Inwagen precisely did. Kingma thinks that the containment view is simply assumed in the literature, and the possibility that a phosphor is not merely contained by the gravitar is not entertained. To see why this matters, consider Kingma's two versions of the intuitive argument, which she correctly considered could be offered in support of the containment view and against her own view. So while neither of these arguments is, I think, formally valid, it's not hard to see how they would work, okay, how you could fix them to make it work. Here's the point. Van Inwagen would deny P1. He thinks phosphors are organisms, and so they can be parts of other organisms. But he would deny P1, but he would affirm 1. So he would tend to say that phosphors are humans. The trouble is that the conceivable analysis of parthood as identity would give principled grounds to deny the second premise, right? It would deny P2, the part-whole claim, and it would affirm number 2. Right. So as Markosian rightly observes, the proponents of the various answers to the special composition question will have their own ways of answering the question about parthood that he wants to answer. And he thinks the most intuitive answer to the question about parthood is a spatial theory that we've seen. Now, for an illustration of the conception of parthood as containment, you might look to the view that is ascribed to Van Inwagen in the literature. In their essay, Composition as a Fiction, Rosen and Dorr discuss what they call a question about composition. It's not actually a question about composition, but I'll spare you the details. It's a question about counting. And they say that Van Inwagen defends the view that several things compose a single thing only when their activity constitutes the life of an organism. And on this view, the cells in your body do indeed compose a single thing. Now, that's actually a view that Van Inwagen rejects tooth and nail, but it would be a view according to which the parts of continuance which are contained within a region of your body compose exactly one thing, namely you. And that would be a view of parthood as containment. The trouble is, it would be a conception according to which parthood and containment would be sufficient for each other. And it would trivialize the debate. What Van Inwagen actually said was a bit more interesting. He said, things compose a thing if and only if their collective activity constitutes a life. Now, what's a life? A life is a special kind of self-maintaining event into which particles of matter are constantly being drawn, and after a short while of participating in the life, they're expelled. It's all going to come down to what we mean by a life, and Van Inwagen coins this locution. He takes a phrase he takes from J.Z. Young's explanation of what it is for the parts of an organism to be caught up into it. And he spells out this way of talking in terms of the vocabulary that he's introduced. To say that X is caught up in a life is to say there are values of the X's such that the X's constitute a life and X is one of the X's, or Y's, it doesn't matter which. Given our answer to the special composition question, it would follow that X is a proper part of something if and only if X is caught up in a life. He offers a footnote. He says this wording presupposes that an organism is not caught up in its own life. Whether one talks of an organism as being caught up in his own life or its own life is a matter of convention. If we adopted the convention that an organism is caught up in its own life, we'd have to say that a thing is a proper part of something just in case it was caught up in a life other than its own. Now, in what follows, Van Inwagen adopts the convention that an organism is not caught up in its own life, but actually, I'm going to suggest that that is precisely what you're going to need to make sense of the bump debate. I hope you can begin to see why lives are going to matter. The key question is going to be how many lives can a thing be caught up into? Van Inwagen suggests we can talk of the life of a simple, the life of a cell, the life of a multicellular organism, and a simple could be caught up into its own life, into the life of a cell, into the life of a multicellular organism. And what I'm going to suggest is the key question for the bump debate is going to be how many lives can a thing be caught up into? So Van Inwagen speaks of life in 3 or 4 ways, but there's at least 2 that are crucial for us. He distinguishes the count noun life, plural term lives, which is used to denote the life of a concrete biological organism, or the event which is supposed to be its life. He also uses the word life as a mass noun to distinguish the processes of life from the occurrence of lives. So here's a crucial section of his text. Not every event that involves the spread of a certain type of life in the mass term sense of life is a life. The growth of a tumor, for example. A tumor is not an organism, it's not a parasite, and there is no self-regulating event, which is its life. The space occupied by a tumor is not filled by some one thing that fits exactly into it. It is a locus within which a certain sort of thing is happening, the spreading out of a certain sort of mass term life. This spreading may be a self-regulating event, self-maintaining event, but it's not well individuated, and despite its entirely biological nature, it is not a life. Now, there's also a technical shorthand for the correct part of a Lockean principle he calls life, and he also uses the word life as a boundary marker to distinguish between contexts of utterance inside and outside the ontology room. In the ontology room, we're engaged in the business of metaphysics. Outside the ontology room, we're engaged in the ordinary business of daily life. Here's the point. Philosophers have missed or failed to see the point of Van Inwagen's organicist principles. For 30 years, they've supposed that they've got something to do with how many things there are supposed to be in a picture region of space or space-time, or whether there really are truly such things as tables, which of course there are. The key here is that everyone has assumed that they know what Van Inwagen means by a life. So Ned Marcosian famously says, although he doesn't define the activity of the X's constitutes a life, he nevertheless does a remarkably good job of shedding light on the relevant concept. I'm actually going to say it's a mistake. He sheds no light at all on the relevant concept, and he knows he doesn't. And Marcosian sort of stops there and says, I will not question whether we understand what it is for an event to count as a life and what it is for the activity of some objects to constitute such an event. Now, if he hadn't stopped to question whether he understood what he was talking about, he might have made different conclusions. Here's Tom Atkinson, again, who says, I, following Van Inwagen, define life as follows: life equals df, z is a life, if and only if z is an event, and so on. No. It is a striking feature of Van Inwagen's book that he never defined life, he never defined a life, and despite his best attempts to develop long and elaborate analogies to defer to the business of biology, he eventually confessed to an inability to explain what a life could be, or what it could be for something to be caught up in a life or into the lives of others. He does defer to biology, and he develops analogies with storms and such. But he says the ultimate answer of the biologist to the question, what is a life, will, I suppose, involve thermodynamic concepts like entropy. I think I can say something in response to this question, but it is rather abstract. I shall attempt to answer the question, what is a life? That is the event, which by constructing what I fear is a lengthy and elaborate analogy. But at the end of the day, he says, look, I've been unable to supplement my principle of life with a coherent set of necessary and sufficient conditions for the persistence of lives. But it's not as if we've been able to say nothing about the persistence of lives. Explanations must come to an end somewhere. Why does this matter? I'm coming into land. There's an Exeter processualist school of philosophers like John Dupre and Anna-Sophia Meinke who have been quite critical of what they call Van Inwagen's thing ontological framework. And they say that biology debunks the idea that biological life is a well-individuated event. If biology debunks that idea, I think Van Inwagen would have been the first to have agreed with it. Van Inwagen concedes that in the last analysis, it's the business of biology to answer the question of what life is, and they say it was wrong from the start to interfere with the biologists' specialists' expertise. I'm just going to say that's a categorically significant mistake. Meinke misses the distinction between the biological processes of life and the event which counts as the life of an organism that is enduring the processes of biological life. Here she is again. While philosophers of biology have not yet reached an agreement on how biological individuality should be conceived, one thing that is widely accepted is that biological life is basically vague, right? It's far from well individuated. And Van Inwagen would say amen to that. I think the irony is quite profound here because as these processualist critics of Van Inwagen's thing ontological framework go on to explain the distinction between a thing and a process, they appeal to the very paradigm that Van Inwagen was trying to shift. And they appeal to the same analogies that Van Inwagen sought to develop to explain in his book, Material Beings. So here's John Dupre. In the living world, whatever that is, a metaphysics of things, he says, is hard to sustain. In the Western tradition of philosophy, a thing has two key features. First, it's self-sufficient, and second, what requires explanation is when a thing changes rather than when it stays the same. Life, he says, conforms to neither of these conditions, and living systems or living organisms exist far from the state we know as thermodynamic equilibrium. Again, I think he's exactly right, but it's not actually relevant to Van Inwagen's distinction. What's the difference between seeing some entity as a thing on one hand and as a stable process on the other? Consider two paradigm cases, a mountain and a storm. That's Van Inwagen's paradigm example. The process ontology of life, they say, starts with the idea that the great red spot on Jupiter is a more useful paradigm for living systems than the mountain. Now, this is undoubtedly true. Again, as I'm sure Margarita Hamida is going to go on to explain, life is a process that maintains certain material objects in a kind of dynamic equilibrium, and there are different kinds of equilibrium. But however the processes of life may be understood, there's going to surely remain a separate question. Can we distinguish the tree of life from the life of a tree, or the life of an organism that is enduring the processes of life, that is caught up into the processes of life? And that's what matters for the metaphysics of pregnancy. So in conclusion, I hope to have shown why Van Inwagen's organicist principles are of categorically significant for the metaphysics of pregnancy and beyond. First, to make sense of the relevant distinction between parthood and mere containment, there must be no metaphysically necessary connection between the occurrence of parthood and the occurrence of mere containment. Second, to do justice to the intuitive argument and the topological arguments, we must rule out a conception according to which proper parthood never occurs, or another according to which containment suffices for parthood. Third, To establish or motivate the relevance of biology for the metaphysics of parthood, we need some sense that the occurrence of biological processes are going to be relevant here. And Van Inwagen gives the principal reason. And fourth, I've put it as 3 here. It motivates a new direction of travel for the future of the bump debate. Now, in footnotes, Elsline-Kingma twice mentions the significance of Van Inwagen's work. First, for an example of how the parthood view might work, citing Van Inwagen's interpretation of cells, individual cells, as having the structure neither of physical simples nor of multicellular organisms. I think she's quite right. Second, for another example of an inadvertent overgeneralization resulting in the implicit unmotivated rejection of the parthood view. And there she's citing Van Inwagen's saying that the largest proper parts of any human beings are individual cells. Now that, unfortunately, is in his discussion of a man enduring brain transplants, not of a pregnant organism enduring pregnancy. Now, I have no desire to clear Peter Van Inwagen of all charges of inadvertent overgeneralization, but I do regard Van Inwagen as a notable exception to Kingma's claims that basically no prominent animalist has ever discussed this. And I think he's devoted an entire chapter of his book to the matter of when the vague parts of continuance, which constitute the matter of a fetus, are caught up into the life of another, the life of its mother. Unfortunately, as a result of a set of prior philosophical commitments which were formed without bearing the possibility of pregnancy in mind, Van Inwagen's organicist principles have been lost in translation. Where does this leave us? I think in one sense it leaves us exactly where we were before. Here's Kingma. If we were to assume with Van Inwagen himself that fetuses are organisms, then the parthood view would require no reinterpretation at all. Thanks for listening.
I'll chair. We can take turns chairing. Thanks very much for that, Chris. Very nice timekeeping. So we have until 11:15 questions. Is that right, Rivka?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll operate a hand finger system. So a hand is a new question. If you've got a question that's like a direct follow-up on the previous question, you can raise a finger. So you can use a finger system or a couple of.
Hello. Can you hear me?
It's a lovely voice.
Okay. I will take that compliment. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. My understanding of Inwagen's organicism was that, so clearly if you are a mereological nihilist, nothing is a part of anything else, so this conversation never takes off. If you're a mereological universalist, then this conversation also doesn't have any substance. So we have to have some kind of solution to the special composition question. And my understanding was that organicism was just a restricted solution to the special composition question. But we don't have to be restricted in that particular way. Any solution to the special composition question will make the bump debate substantial, right? We could have like construct non-living pregnant robots or something. The fact that we are talking about living organisms here is just, just so happens to be that that's what we're talking about. But if we had a contact view of solution to the special composition question, if we had, I don't know, come up with any of the various absurd options out there, you would then be able to debate when is a foster a part of a gravider. Now, you don't need a specifically organicist. You don't need a definition of life, which is just as well, because we don't have one.
Thank you. I think in one sense you're absolutely right. That's a good point. So I think what I'd want to say is to interpret the bump debate, you need to do more than simply give conceptions according to which proper parenthood sometimes occurs. And what I'm trying to do is keep it in line with the dialectic. So it's not simply you need some vague account, which you do. It's that you need to motivate the sense that, bluntly, biology is sort of relevant here. So I think if you adopted something like a contact view or something like that, notwithstanding the fact that that's got problems of its own, it wouldn't give any kind of reason to think that Kingma was looking in the right place when she was looking at things like topological connectedness and biological accounts of biological individuation. I think you've got to give some sense of why that would be relevant. And I think that's what sort of needs to be explained. But I take the point. I think all I'm trying to show is once you set the bump debate up as it has been, I wanted to show two cases which would give principled reasons for saying the debate makes no sense. I think what I'd need to do further, and thank you for the point, is I need to show that I've got quite a demanding task of making sense of this debate in particular. But I think the categorical restriction to organisms is significant, but I'd need to think more about that.
Question online? Question online, Amber. Amber, sorry. Oh, hi Amber, yeah, go ahead. I should say, Amber sent me a message that she's not feeling well, and that's why she's joining from her hotel, but she is actually here in London and will join us. Why she's feeling a bit better.
Can you guys hear me okay in the room?
Yeah.
I think someone's giving me a thumbs up. Okay. I only see very, very little people. That's why. So thank you for this, Chris. I think to some extent this is related to the previous question. And maybe it's just not a question that you're particularly interested in. I don't know, but I'd like to hear your intuitions on this. So I think a lot of times when we're doing philosophy of pregnancy, we tend to forget about like pregnancy loss and miscarriage and things like that. And so I'm wondering on your account, because, you know, the notion of life plays such a central notion and a living organism and so on to your account. I'm thinking about these cases in which someone has had, for example, like a miscarriage. So the foster has died, but remains within the spatial context of like remains in the uterus, for example. And in terms of like medical diagnosis, the person would still count as pregnant insofar as like HCG levels are high, the body's still doing all the things that it does when it's pregnant, right? At least from the gravidas side. So everything's still kind of functioning in that, but you no longer have what is considered like a living something in the uterus. Does that throw a wrench into anything that you've been thinking of? Like, when does pregnancy end, for example? It doesn't always end via this kind of birth. Would the person still count as pregnant if the fetus is dead? I mean, I'm just curious how you would navigate that kind of conceptual territory.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amber, and hope you get well soon. So I gave a talk at the Yale School for Medicine and Spirituality and Religion in the medical school in Yale. And I met a woman who's a kind of obs and gynae pediatric pediatrician, or basically her name was Lubna something. And she gave this example of literal Petri dishes, right, in fridges down the hall from where they were, where she said, we are now in a situation where all of the kind of cell lineages can be there, which are required to constitute a human being in this case. But she said that, and yet they're in disarray, and the potential for life is not there. And I was absolutely gripped by this distinction between, well, the notion of array, right? What it is to be in array. And I think that vagueness of that notion just is the vagueness of the distinction. It's a subtle one between the event which constitutes the life of an organism and the kind of spreading out of a certain kind of mass term life that you might find in the growth of a parasite or something like that. And I think precisely the vagueness of that subtle distinction, it's the right kind of vagueness, right? It's precisely the kind of question that we're not sure about. So I wouldn't at all want to sort of clean up that nice, tidy problem and tragedy with a kind of nice, tidy answer. I think it's precisely the vagueness of that question which the distinction between the countdown life and the processes of life is tracking. So I confess I haven't done more thought than that, but I would love to follow up with Lubna this notion of array. And I think probably it would be, if there could be such a thing as the boundary case between, say in a case of an ectopic pregnancy or something, where when do you have something more akin to a parasite or a growth? And when do you have a kind of viable pregnancy? That notion of viability is going to be in there. That's off the top of my head, but I'd be very glad to have any help on that.
No, that's great. Thanks. And maybe some of the stuff on pregnancy as potentiality that's coming later today, maybe that would be a really interesting place to kind of, latch onto this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what Margarita's got to say. I think she might enlighten me, certainly.
Yeah, Margarita is next, I think, in the queue. Thank you.
How about now? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, thanks. That was incredibly interesting. So I have a small comment and then a question. So my comment is kind of in line with what Arjun said, which is that, so Van Inwagen's view is a view of composition. It's not a view of what organisms are, it's a view of composition. And for him, in order to get composition, you need to have lives, whether something is caught up in the life, in a life, is what gets you composition. So naturally, on that view, the individuation of lives is going to turn out to be really important, and surprisingly. But if you have some other view of composition that gets you some objects, and then some of these objects are organisms, then actually what you need is just the individuation of organisms. And lives are just the life processes of those organisms. You don't need the individuation of lives to play any important role. Okay, so that was just like a comment. And then my question was, why do you think that the view of, why do you think that, for example, having a theory of containment as parthood is going to trivialize the debate rather than solve it in a particular way?
Thanks, Margarita. I can take the second question earlier. It's because the containment view builds in the negation of the parthood view. So if you introduce a notion of containment, which is analyzed in terms of parthood, then you've got a contradiction. As for the first question, of course, I know exactly the bound state answer that you're referring to and the kind of answer that you're thinking of. In a sense, I kind of want to say, fine. If you've got some composite objects, some of which are composite organisms, the bump debate is categorically restricted to organisms. So we're precisely talking about those composite organisms. And then the question will be for for any composite organism, you need an account of a kind of principled way of counting them. Well, one way of counting would be by lives. One way of counting would be by sortals. It's going to be a one-to-one tracking. For every organism, there'll be an event which is its life. I'll note the point that Van Inwagen thinks a simple is caught up into its own life. And so you can have a simple being caught up into its own life, the life of a cell, the life of a multicellular organism. Maybe that itself can be caught up into the life of a pregnant whole organism. I actually think this notion of a life is so expansive, you can think about the cosmos having a life of its own, an ecosystem or whatever. You're just going to have a series of nested lives. And I don't really have a view of how expansive that can be, but for any organism, it would make perfect sense to distinguish its life, just as I could distinguish effortlessly between the life of a particle and the particle itself. Yeah, maybe that's a problem. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Could I have a quick follow-up?
Sure.
I think that's, yeah, I think that I agree with that. So when you asked how many lives can something be caught up in, do you think that there's any reason why we should expect that there's some kind of limit to that? Or it's just, well, we need an account of when that happens, but in principle, there's no limit.
I actually agree with that. Yeah, I think there'll be epistemological questions about when you could tell when lives are occurring. But metaphysically, conceivably, yeah, I really don't see a limit. And I think this potential of this answer has been missed, I think, in the literature. So this is why I think the metaphysical individuation of lives matters, and it matters for the metaphysics of pregnancy and beyond. And what I'm trying to do is sort of shift the debate. I think it has to go in this direction. What counts as a life in the science of life? Yeah. It seems to be precisely the question we're asking, right? So if you ask, I was at the Leverhulme Center for Life in the Universe and discussing Carol Cleland's work on life without definitions. You could ask, when does life begin? 4 billion years ago, right? When are we looking for signs of the origins of the processes of life? We might be looking for metabolism. We might be looking for all sorts of things. When did your life begin, or the life of a tree, or the life of an organism, or the life of a fetus, right, begin? That seems to be the way we need to head in this debate if we're going to, I think, make progress. So I don't have an answer.
I just think that it's precisely because of that continuity of life processes over 4 billion years that it's more promising to try to individuate organisms than to try and individuate life events. But okay, thanks.
I mean, I agree, but it's a sort of conceptual point. It's going to be a one-to-one correlation, right? This precisely the question of how you individuate organisms, and there is no settled answer on that. It's going to be exactly the same as the individuation of lives, but there is a categorical distinction, which I think is important.
Laura, yes?
Yeah. But you had a follow-up.
Oh, sorry.
It's just like a quick finger on that. I don't think Margarita or I are disputing whether life is important because we're talking about pregnant organisms and organisms are alive. We're just suggesting that the whole conversation can move forward without a solution to the question of what is a life, how do we individuate lives, which is a good thing because that is a terrible, like, protean amorphous monster that we don't want to do. We want to be able to have this conversation without first solving the question of what is life. And I think we can, because there are other options for solutions to the special composition question. You can also just assume, which I think Elsa-Line does, that there are composite objects and, you know, there are organisms. Let's just put aside the special composition question and then move straight into the debate about parts and wholes. We are assuming here that there is a solution to the special composition question, and it does to some extent hang over us, but we don't have to know what a life is in order to talk about this stuff.
The issue I'm pressing is not the protean monster of what life is. It's the distinction between whatever life is and what a life is. And that's subtle. But if you can distinguish between the tree of life and the life of a tree, then I think I'm away. Yeah. This is a hard problem, right? I'm just saying little lives matter in precisely this debate. If you're going to just take it for granted that there are composite objects, fine, so does Vennebergen. There's never a question of for him whether there are such things as composite objects, and the question is when that composition occurs. And with all due respect, there are other problems which, in other work, I've shown the promissory note of a bound state answer to the special composition question really does need to be cashed out. And as I've shown elsewhere, that there are formal, practical, final, categorically significant reasons why it's not even begun to address the special composition question. So, I mean, that's a longer conversation, but I think they're on the right lines. Yeah, I just think they're not there yet. So it's quite a promissory note to cash out.
Yeah, sorry, just make sure you've got the microphone. We have one. Yes, you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'm trying to repeat. Just a clarificatory question to understand what you just said to Professor Nida about containment and parenthood. Can you please precisely tell me what is the relationship that you are using to relate parenthood and containment? Because probably I missed that harmony principle you're referring to. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I caught the question, so please forgive me if I get this wrong, but I think you were asking to clarify what the relation between parthood and containment was?
Yeah, the one that you employed, because I believe that there might be many, and I don't understand which one you're referring to precisely.
I mean, it might be that Margarita will be better placed to address that question in her talk, but maybe I'll just show you the relevant slide. Where is it? There. So there's a couple of problems here. Containment is one word for many things.
Yeah, I think I was actually referring to the one where you also mentioned the sub-regionhood.
Right. Right. This is Marcosian's spatial theory of parthood. So what Marcosian does is he says X is a part of Y, and what he means is X is a proper part of Y. If and only if the region of space occupied by X is a subset of the region of space occupied by Y. Now, without getting too much into the weeds of mereological theory, there's categorical problems here because that introduces a second order function. So mereotopological notions of parthood on regions, which Akilvasi and Casati develop in Parts and Places, are a categorically different notion of parthood than applies on the first order parts of continuance which may occupy the regions. So if you introduce an ordered distinction between the parts of continuance and the parts of regions that they occupy, then you can make sense of Marcosian's spatial theory of parthood. But the problem is you're interpreting one notion of parthood in terms of another. And this is especially tricky if you think like Akilvasi and others, that there is only one notion of parthood. So there's a worry even for this theory of parthood as containment. Here's why it matters. If you cash out parthood in terms of regions of occupied space, then if you go back to the containment view, which entails the negation of the parthood view, you're going to introduce a contradiction. That's my point. I wish I could be in the room with you, and it would, I'm sure, be easier to talk through like that, but that's my best attempt.
Well, thank you. Understand that I'm not going to reasons, but thank you.
That brings us to our modified schedule, which now only exists in my mind.